Wikke's research and PhD was focusing on urban governance and infrastructure planning with a focus on developing cities, and her case studies were in Indonesia. So she's very interested in understanding the role of transformative action by actors in cities, in developing cities, in basically unlocking those systems and identifying pathways for what we call leapfrogging to more sustainable practices and modes of infrastructure planning. So I just hand over to Wikke, who's going to present basically her PhD research over the past 3 years. Over to you, Wikke.
Yeah, thank you, Shirin, and thank you everyone for showing up to my talk today. So as Shirin has indicated, I'm going to talk today about my research, which I did in my PhD, focusing on some of the key contributions that come out of that research and the empirical insights that I've drawn from the 2 cases that I was studying in 2 Indonesian cities. Hopefully you can go away with a little bit better understanding of the developing city context and how sustainable transformation can, in practice, be enacted in those cities and in those contexts. Why developing cities, really? The main reason being that developing cities, as compared to the developed economies, will actually bear the disproportionate burden of globally urbanizing world. So as the United Nations has estimated that by around 2050, 9 out of 10 of the mega cities, which are cities with 10 million or more urban inhabitants, will actually be found in the developing world, particularly in Asia and Africa. And around 60% of those megacities will be from the Asia-Pacific region alone. This represents a big challenge, and at the same time, we also know that actually the bulk of urban knowledge being currently produced is predominantly concentrated from and in developed city context. So this structural problem when it comes to the urban knowledge production is actually a subject of a recent Nature Sustainability publication, if you're interested in that. So the paper actually also urged for more urban theoretical building and empirical research from the global urban south, basically. So we know that urbanization and climate change actually have given rise to and will continue to exacerbate various forms of urban vulnerabilities. In terms of climate change impacts, for instance, we know that major coastal cities in the developing world are the most vulnerable to sea level rise. And the other forms of urban vulnerabilities include the large number of people living in squatter settlements. It's estimated that around over 800 million people are living in that kind of conditions today. And there are also a big number of people living without basic access to sanitation, around 2.3 billion people worldwide, which predominantly are found in developing cities. Again, so if we take a look at infrastructure delivery as a key requirement for developing cities to sort of alleviate these urban vulnerabilities, then we are also presented with this knowledge that there is a big significant gap in infrastructure investment in that developing context. So for instance, if we just take the recent estimate by ADB, basically currently only around about half of the investment requirements are being met annually in the Asia-Pacific region alone. So there is a big gap when we talk about that. And then when we turn and consider the implementation of sustainable development goals in developing cities, which can include these goals that are presented here, 6, 9, 11, 13, or even more, we are actually asking the difficult questions of what and how alternative low-cost infrastructure solutions can actually be deployed in those cities to deliver multiple benefits, which include basic service provision, protection from environmental threats, improvement of social well-being, and environmental quality. And Then we also know, however, that the traditional way of delivering infrastructure services in those developing contexts are much driven by the aspiration to implement large-scale gray infrastructure solutions that are often found in advanced economies. This is despite growing evidences that we cannot rely solely on this gray infrastructure system because they can actually compromise the ability of city to cope with climate impacts. And research in developed city contexts also have shown that the sunk investment made to deliver those big infrastructure solutions in Western contexts have actually limited the ability of those cities to adopt more alternative, adaptive infrastructure system. So when I talk about this adaptive resilience infrastructure, this more resilient type of infrastructure system, there is an increasingly more attention to green infrastructure, or also interchangeably known as the nature-based solutions, as potentially a viable alternative to complement gray infrastructure. And if we look at the gap of infrastructure investment in developing cities, that also means that there is actually fewer entrenchment in the legacy infrastructure, and that also means that potentially there are fewer barriers for adoption, faster adoption of these green, more sustainable infrastructure solutions in those cities. So against this backdrop, my research tried to understand whether developing or how developing cities can actually unlock their transformative capacities to accelerate the implementation of more sustainable infrastructure solutions. So I considered this question from a governance perspective. Oh, what did I do?
No, I don't know.
Yeah. So I considered it from a governance perspective. And so governance, if we talk about governance, it is basically, according to UN Habitat, is the software that enables urban hardware to function. Governance, theoretically speaking or analytically speaking, can be understood as the proposed interplay between agents and structures to enact various processes in the cities to deliver certain outcomes. And increasingly, governance has been considered as indispensable in the way we think about how we can address these global challenges that are presented in the world today. So basically, my argument here is that the current governance mode, or that software, is actually not well suited to promoting and adopting more infrastructure solutions in most cities. That means that we have to look at the way in which we can alter some of these governance modes to enable more faster adoption of infrastructure solutions, basically. So when we talk about understanding change, I turn into this literature or study around complex societal transformation. And when we look at the recent debate around this concept, the research basically showed that, recent literature actually shows that transformation as a concept overlaps with transitions. So they are both terms are used to describe and to also interpret complex nonlinear change. Both terms, however, the two terms actually stem from different research streams, but recent years have seen it coming closer and closer. When we talk about the differences between the terms, basic transitions perspective is more predominantly used to study societal subsystems, such as the energy system, water system, or transport systems, and more recently the cities. On the other hand, transformation as a concept is often used more broadly to understand a fundamental shift in the underlying norms and values in the society. So it's a broader sort of concept. And a recent literature review on the transformation, or the way transformation as a concept has been used across literature, including the socio-ecological resilience literature, socio-technical studies, sustainable sciences, have concluded there is actually no consensus around what transformation actually means or entails. There's a lot of debate around the concept itself, and they identified the two common uses of the term. Firstly, it's commonly used as a loose metaphor for change, and the other way it's being used is as an analytical concept to study the change processes. So in my own research, I take the analytical standpoint, so I'm using the term. So I'm defining transformation in terms of a fundamental shift in societal practices occurring over time through this iterative and processes of searching for new alternative solutions and embedding them in the societies. And yeah. So now we are coming closer to the core contribution of my research. Here, my aim basically is to operationalize the concept of transformative agency. The literature on transformative agency itself is still in its infancy, and there's a recent study that have literature review, a systematic literature review that have suggested that agency itself is a part of this broader concept that the author called the urban transformative capacity. So this urban transformative capacity is basically a broader framework that encompasses not just agency, but also the core development processes, which include things like system thinking, learning, experimentation, and things around. So a range of other processes there. And the notion of agency itself is more often used in literature to study or analyze the role of certain types of actors. If we look across the sustainable transition literature, the agency has been analyzed using different concepts, especially to examine the transformative potential that can be attributed to certain types of actors, basically ranging from technology, policy, institutional entrepreneurs, bridging intermediary organizations, civic activism, empowered communities, individual leadership. So there's a whole lot of concepts around that. Whilst the emphasis on certain type of actors remain very useful, there's also a tendency to just highlight the role of certain elite types of actors, especially the technology and policy entrepreneurs. And so this entrepreneurial lens particularly tends to conflate change activities with innovation-related activities. The narrow focus here is that they focus mostly on techno-scientific knowledge production processes and then the interplay with formal policy processes that could create that enabling environment for innovations to emerge. But this narrow focus prevents a broader look at a range of other change-related activities. For this, I mean, for instance, there is little known about the way practical politics or informal processes could actually influence change dynamics. And only very recently, the role of civic activism and community-led initiatives are being studied in the literature. So by emphasizing the role of certain actors in certain cases, it also prevents comparative analysis being made to contrast the role of different actors working under the same condition to influence a certain change agenda in that context. And then this basically, there is also this emerging theme where the sustainability literature basically has come to a sort of a loose agreement that that transformation would need the kind of agency that are distributed and embedded in the local context, basically. This is an expansion of the notion of transformative agency, basically. So with that background in mind, my research, I draw from practice and institutional theory to try to enrich the literature by unpacking the iterative and interactive production and reproduction of structure and agency. So the practice perspective, as argued by several recent studies, is probably more suitable to study to examine micro strategies and expressed through everyday strategic conducts by actors, as compared to the earlier focus on that sort of meso-level change activities that I talked about earlier. So this is because practice perspectives basically take the series of regularized action as the unit of analysis, rather than assuming from the outset of the certain types of actors, for instance. It might sound counterintuitive that I'm talking about repetitive action when actually I'm trying to examine change. But I have to highlight as well that in practice perspective, basically, actors are not conceived as this cultural dope that just repeat past behaviors, but they actually have the capabilities to monitor the context and exercise power. Power is the transformative aspect of that action that could enact change in an iterative and repetitive manner. So the argument here is that for transformation to gain legitimacy, it needs to be repeated. It needs to, the way it gains legitimacy and the way it gains the structural power is by being repeated and being continued over a great number of people in the society. So what else do I have to talk about here? So yeah, anyway, taking that practice lens, we developed the diagnostic framework for strategic agency. So this framework basically guides the analysis of the iterative actions and repeated patterns of interactions among actors. And this basically helps distinguish the relative effectiveness of micro strategies for facilitating or hindering changes. So when we also consider that transformation actually requires this entanglement from deeply held rules and resource systems, that also means that transformative agency will likely involve a feat of taking on this repetitive and iterative task of searching for new solutions and eventually embedding them as new sequences of practice, basically. And then, and the collective aspect of agency is also highlighted here. It's because it's unlikely that the legitimacy of the new practices can be achieved with just one-off kind of change activities. So the interplay between new practice sequence and the more established practice sequence will give rise to also subtle or even more obvious tensions among the group of actors when they go into negotiation in terms of the new meanings and norms and how resource should be reconfigured among them. So when it comes to the empirical standpoint, the focus on the collective means that the quality of transformative agency needs to be derived by cross-examining the role of different groups of actors in shaping the urban system. And this essentially provides a more holistic observation or impression of the quality of transformative agency and where tensions arise and how iterative negotiation eventually gives rise to new processes and new outcomes. So this is my research design. I won't go into too much detail, but I will highlight that I'm using multiple case design and in-depth case study approach. I've selected 2 urban initiatives in Jakarta and Surabaya. So in Jakarta, I'm looking at master plan for the development of a master plan for this, a large-scale flood defense initiative. And in Surabaya, I'm looking at the relatively more successful green initiatives that involve community participation as well as an aspect of it. So both cases provide a sort of complementary angle to study the way in which microstrategies can hinder or facilitate transformation. So the NCICD, so this is the project in Jakarta. Jakarta is a mega city situated in a low-lying coastal zone, and it's very prone to urban flooding. And the flooding has been exacerbated in recent years with rapid land subsidence. So the project itself is called NCICD, or National Capital Integrated Coastal Development Project. It has put forward this design of large-scale flood defense system and basically closing off the Bay of Jakarta, and it's combined with land development and land reclamation as well. But this plan has since been modified, especially the aspect of these two big aspects of it are particularly controversial. And by contrast, this is Surabaya. It is the second largest city in Indonesia with about 3 million population. The Green Initiative is well known for its citywide public space revitalization and greening of low to middle income neighborhoods. So here in the picture, you can see some of the green infrastructures being implemented, from provision of green open spaces to sustainable management of solid waste, urban gardening and farming in neighborhoods level. So now I'm going to the analysis of the data. Basically, I'll start by charting the momentum of the development of the master plan in Jakarta from 1997 to 2017, when my last data collection period was conducted. So this first 10 decades indicate the larger context of infrastructure investment in Indonesia. During that period, basically in 1998, there was an Asian financial crisis which impacted the way infrastructure spending was implemented. So there has been a major bottleneck, basically, infrastructure spending in Indonesia. And this lasted for many years. In 2007, basically, there was an environmental trigger. There was a large scale a flood that occurred in Jakarta, and that essentially renewed the commitment of the government to increase infrastructure spending in the water sector. And because of the flood as well, the government come up with this technical proposal, which was the NCICD, to quickly fix the situation, basically. And but over the time, this technical proposal has then evolved to incorporate more of the urban development priorities in the region. That's where you see the private sectors coming in. So the interplay between this urban policy the national policy making and the private sector role in it actually have seen this mega proposal being put forward. It actually amounted to around $50 billion over the course of the next 50 years, consisting of a combined contribution from the private and public sectors. But then the program opponents basically argue that this is a cooptation of the public policy making by the private sector interests, especially with regards to the land reclamation aspect of the project. And the policy opponents essentially launch a counter movement, timed with the news of a bribery scandal that emerged around that time in relation to the program. So the bribery scandal basically involved a local parliamentarian, which was allegedly receiving a graft from a private developer to alter a draft regulation around the land reclamation aspect of the project. And because of this scandal, basically what the government did was they called for an update to the master plan, but at the time of writing of my thesis, basically this has not been announced publicly yet, but based on some media references, it's unlikely that they will do a drastic change to the plan. There are some minor concessions in terms of just delaying the offshore seawall plan, and and the land reclamation components until further feasibility study is conducted. So the same thing was done for the Surabaya case. Basically, I chart the momentum of the Green City initiatives from over the course of 3 decades, more or less. Starting from 1984, we can see here there is basically two main waves of green transformations. So the first wave is typically associated with Mayor Kasidi. There is a lot of similar activities around green initiatives during this first 10 decades. But then it goes into decline as the mayor change. Also around that time, basically the national government has changed their priorities towards supporting more acceleration on economic development or neoliberal type of agenda. And the type of engagement around that time was very much top-down, and the city government basically didn't have a lot of say in the way they could develop their cities. But then, so in this decline period, we also see a lot of rapid land conversion, and there is as well decline in the way the public sectors were delivering the services, and this culminated in a waste crisis in 2001. And then almost sort of simultaneously around well, not simultaneous, but a few years in between, in 1998, basically there is a political upheavals at the national level. The central government was overtopped, the authoritarian government basically overruled, and the political system changed from centralized to decentralized. So that gives also the city government a lot more autonomy in determining their infrastructure agenda. And then this basically marked the second wave of the green movements. The second wave of green movements are often associated with the leadership of Mayor Risma. She is the current mayor of the city. So for going into more detail, I'm going to go through back to the analysis of Jakarta. Basically here I'm going to discuss the agency in the two cities, and based on my analysis of the micro strategies, I sort of could draw these factors, a number of factors that are actually influencing the constraint agency that we see in Jakarta, and then other factors that are associated with more the transformative agency kind of activities in Surabaya. So in Jakarta, the NCICD was initiated as sort of a response to the flood event. And during that time, the proponents of the NCICD tried to create urgency using a grand narrative to save the capital from sinking. And they also tapped onto historical ties with foreign development sectors and a few policy entrepreneurs to boost knowledge production around that time. So this micro-strategizing, especially in the initial phase, actually involved only a few handful elite bureaucrats and representing particularly the traditional dominance of the technical sectors. And this practice essentially alienated whole other sectors within the government. So internally, it is actually undermining formal commitments. This massive project requires commitments from across a range of governmental bodies, but this was undermined because of this strategy that they enacted in the beginning. And then furthermore, this political, or the perception that there is a political and economic domination by the foreign sector, and then the development sector also bred external distrust. So this external distrust then was escalated in the form of the counter movements I talked about before in 2015 during the bribery scandal. But it has to be noted that even before the scandal occurred, a few policy opponents already actually micro-strategized by withdrawing from policy discussion, and they also withhold their formal commitment. So it's a form of strategic conduct to basically delay decisions. And the scandal essentially allows these loosely linked policy opponents to launch into bigger movements and to sort of throw their concerns into the public consciousness. And especially with the backing of the media as well around that time. So, but given the lack of regularized coordination among the key actors that were behind the counter movements, and then also the sort of the one-off and very polarizing nature of the scandal, they actually could not go into a productive negotiations with the proponents. In the end, they basically failed to push for just change, push for fundamental change to the program, or even the sort of the coalition behind the agenda. And the proponents were able to push forward with just minor concessions, basically, to dampen that backlash. So then, what about Surabaya, and what kind of micro-strategizing can we distinguish in this case? So, in contrast to Jakarta, in the early days of the green initiatives, policy advocates in Surabaya basically work very closely with select numbers of community members to basically negotiate new meanings, norms, resource configurations, to eventually encode this new practice as the identity and enduring characters of the urban communities and neighborhoods where they work in. So these institutional groundworks were basically established slowly through tailored advocacy, what I call tailored advocacy, everyday activism, and backyard experimentations over the course of many years. And this strategy basically tapped onto local leaders and local knowledge. For instance, it engaged very closely with local women organizations and traditional leaders to foster social innovations and social norms that in the end legitimize the green initiatives. So through such localized micro-strategies, basically the urgency for change was shaped by recognizing and drawing on the everyday experiences of the community that live in those low to middle income neighborhoods. And if we compare it to the grand scale of the narrative used in Jakarta, then the early narrative for community participation in Surabaya actually reflects on the resource poor conditions of the settlements and leverage the small contribution that each member of the community can put in to improve the quality of the infrastructure and quality of life. So while the early green movements basically established the groundworks, the transformation processes basically take a backseat between 1994 and 2002, as I highlighted earlier, due to changing political priority. And so this event basically indicates that change processes of transformation fluctuates. It's not a linear process. And it also indicates that change is not irreversible. It's possible to go back. And but then, despite of all the declines, in 2001 we see the second wave of green movements taking shape. But these civil movements, I would argue, was successful because of also the groundwork that were already there in the first instance, the groundwork that was built in terms of embedding community activism and community participation. And the shift towards a more democratic political context in the second wave basically allowed the civic actors to negotiate with city bureaucrats for a more collaborative regime in shaping the urban agenda. And then only in the later stage, strategic links with private sectors were forged, also with the global sort of networks to enhance co-funding of new initiatives and to legitimize the program on the global level. And then, interestingly as well, so once these green movements start to gain momentum and become a relatively more dominant mode of delivering infrastructure in the city, we also see this symbolic type of leadership or political cultural leadership come to the fore to reinforce basically the message and the ideals of what the green initiatives mean. This symbolic leadership was especially embodied by the the mayor I mentioned before, Mayor Risma. She is very well known for her street-style leadership, and which has earned her a lot of high approval and rating among the public, as well as showing her dedication to the agenda, basically. But such symbolic use of power in Surabaya is actually springing from that groundworks that were already there earlier. And it is powerful because it is powerful and effective because it's springing from that from that groundworks among the community groups, and then it was enhanced with the active media involvement. And then during that period, the government could do a lot more, or the community, the whole of the city was behind this idea of upscaling the green initiatives a lot more. But at the same time, I want to highlight that while this case shows the relative success of the green movements, I should also note that the scaling up has yet to meaningfully reach, for instance, the high-end residential neighborhoods. So this is area where I think the transformative agency has not yet taken hold or taken shape in. So overall, 2 more pages. And then I will finish. Basically, the main message here is that in my research, particularly in Indonesian context, I saw that constrained agency is often associated with political and economic domination by elite policy entrepreneurs and private sectors. And then there's a failure to translate urgency on the local level, on the local everyday languages and practice. And then which in turn also lead to failure in generating shared commitments behind a particular solutions. Meanwhile, when we talk about this distributed transformative agency in Surabaya, it is often associated with tailored advocacy, everyday activism, and also this backyard experimentation. And on a later stage, the upscaling of the experiments were then achieved by tapping onto private sectors, global networks. And then even on the later stage in that process, the acceleration of the transformation is associated with the symbolic leadership. They are not necessarily the reason for the upscaling, but it's sort of come hand in hand in that sense to embody and circulate the urban ideals, basically, across the city. So what I have to stress is that the sequencing of the action is quite important to consider. In Jakarta, we see that the infrastructure agenda took shape by the domination of elites in the first place, and then followed by the symbolic use of power to shape these grand narratives which did not resonate with the reality of living in the city. And then it was followed by these reactive efforts to fix the design and fix the relationship among the proponents and opponents. And whereby in Surabaya, the sequencing is almost the other way around, I would say. It starts with policy advocates working closely with small groups of task communities to basically negotiate meaning, shared values, and negotiate even solutions through everyday activism. And this was then followed by more symbolic use of power by a few elites to amplify enthusiasm and to upscale the experiments. So in conclusion, my research highlighted a range of micro-strategies And also it emphasizes the role of distributed embedded agency within local socio-cultural context to carry the momentum forward. That's it. Thank you for your time. And
thanks, Wikke. I have a question, but maybe I'll wait and go after other questions. Is there any question from the room? Yeah.
Thank you. Hi, Wikke. It was a very good presentation. I think it's really interesting to see some of the outputs of your research. I guess my question is about the Jakarta seawall and also the idea of actually relocating Jakarta and whether that played a role in the degree of movement in that strategy and what sort of complications when you have two very big visions for a city, what impact that would have.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question, but I think during my research, actually, that didn't come out to the front, like the relocation of the capital. There was an interesting observation from you, though, but it didn't really come out as something in my research. But I would imagine perhaps, I think what could explain it is that often this kind of agenda in Jakarta context occur in separate groups. It's very siloed. Even this big agenda, often you find that it's just being backed by a few groups of people here, and then this is another type of, so maybe that's why they don't speak to each other. And yeah, that's probably my comment. I don't know if I answer your question.
So perhaps compare this the urban development agenda in Surabaya. Was there other sort of competing strategies for the greening program, like that possibly was in Jakarta?
Yeah. I see what you were saying. So not really, not in that sense, but there are actually activities outside of the sort of the legitimized picture of the green initiatives that are actually happening. I didn't highlight that, but it's part of my research, but today I didn't talk about that. For instance, there is this small group of communities behind the mangrove protection, which has not been highlighted as such as part of the green initiatives. And when I talked with them as well, they indicated that they actually strategically wanted to be a bit separate from the green initiatives in some sense. It's interesting because there are also some groups of more critical policy actors in Surabaya as well that sort of highlighted that this is potentially just a sort of a cosmetic kind of improvement. It's also there for sure. But I think the way they are doing things there is a bit different in the sense that even when they sit outside of the project, they are still engaging in the policy discussions. You often find a lot of these critiques are still there actively advocating for what they stand for, So, yeah.
Thanks so much for that. Yeah, I was just reflecting on, there's quite a bit of overlap with my own doctoral research looking at transformative urban experimentation and related governance sort of issues. And I was interested to hear about your discussion of distributed agency. And I was looking, I guess, at how a civil society movement in particular was leveraging networks like the internet and distributed platforms and that sort of thing to enable those kinds of activities to occur. Did you observe similar kinds of ways that these, like the way that distributed agency was manifested through the internet or through various digital platforms or enabled?
Yeah, I didn't look at that in particular, but it was actually, I think, probably part of it, especially on the later stage, like when the media come into play a bit more on the, so they basically have created this green competition in Surabaya, for instance, and then there's a lot of publications, popular publications around that in terms of internet and this kind of thing. I think it does play a role in sort of more recent times especially, but to be honest, I cannot comment very usefully on that, but I would imagine it does play a role. But I would think that that could become a part of the strategy, I would say. So yeah, in terms of upscaling sort of this idea of the movement in that sense. And a lot of the partners that sort of go, in Surabaya, it's more like, I feel like it's a lot more, not saying that the internet doesn't matter, but well, the thing that was shown more or talked about more was this going to house and, you know, engaging people in that way. That's a lot more what's happening there. And on the street, like creating festivals or, you know, this kind of thing happen a lot more. Yeah. But yeah, I would be interested if you notice something in your own research in this space. Do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of sort of more grassroots movements are kind of being mobilized through digital technologies to organize their activities and to reduce transaction costs of having to get out on the ground.
In Indonesia, WhatsApp.
WhatsApp?
Probably. Yeah. I would imagine that's a very important part of that. Yeah,
absolutely. So, I mean, I just think it's a trend across, you know, all different civil society movements to be using these sort of platforms to enable distributed agency and to coordinate their activities, to get people, you know, out of their houses onto the streets, to be, you know, working together, to be sharing strategies, stories, whatever it might be, to be organising together. Yeah.
No, I think that's it's very exciting area to learn more about, I think. My own research didn't really look at that in particular, but yeah, would imagine there could be something there.
And it could be that it didn't really come up clearly in your interviews or your observations when you were there, because when you showed that momentum diagram, a lot of those lead periods were actually before.
Yeah, before that.
You know, that digital platforms and social media became big things. So, at least but as you said, like in going forward and upscaling, that might play a more significant role.
Yeah, it was really only taken off, I guess, you know, paid attention since like the rise of the Arab Spring, I guess, around, was that 2010 or 2012? Yeah, so it's only been very recently that. Yeah. But
also the difference was that even in those contexts, there were, again, like mostly like middle class urban type, whereas a lot of, at least from what I know, like in Surabaya, a lot of those are like urban slums that have been.
Not slums, but
like kampung, which is in between slums and almost, I don't know.
I think I've got a question. I'm not sure it's right. I'm curious by the finding that trying to sell the big picture narrative was largely or less successful than the grassroots. I think there's a pretty dominant school of thought, certainly in Australia, that's not the case, that you need to sell someone on a big picture narrative, often get elected on those big picture narratives, and then create moral social license to do the things you need to do. So I'm wondering if you can unpack a little bit more about where they went wrong, or what were the conditions that led to that not working?
I think, that's a very good point actually, but the way I see it is, maybe it's not necessarily the narrative that is wrong, or, well, narrative cannot be wrong in the first place, I suppose. Like, it depends on which group are there using a narrative. I think what went wrong in Jakarta perhaps is this maybe a bit of overconfidence perhaps by the proponents that it will get accepted because of the scale of things, and then the way it was communicated was also not it wasn't the best communication strategy, I think. They come up with this master plan and only in a later stage just announce it as given. And because of the scale of the things, when you are talking about big narratives, I think there are two aspects to it. On one hand, it could be very attractive and interesting to go on board with this big picture things, but at the same time, you will also if people dislike it, it will be also quite obvious and quite polarizing because of the scale. So you are faced with this sort of contradiction, I guess, in a sense. Like, one hand, it could actually draw people in. On the other hand, it also could generate this strong response against the narrative, basically. While in Surabaya, the case is, there is now this big picture thing, but it wasn't that in the beginning. It was more like, this has gradually sort of evolved into something big across the city, so the legitimacy was sort of built slowly. That's how I would, answer that question, I think. Yeah.
But was it also the case that that big narrative was disconnected from what people were actually feeling about the city? I mean, the fact that the capital was sinking or something, was that disconnected with what people really viewed as?
Yeah, so that's the other part of it for sure, in the sense that I think people definitely, not that people in Jakarta don't care about flooding, they do feel the impact of flooding in that sense, but then the focus on sort of, let's do this modernizing project where we have this big seawall to sort of move development forward and increase investment in the cities didn't really resonate with a lot of people, and especially when they talk about closing the bay. There are these fishing communities across the bay that were not consulted about this idea, and that's where, the sort of the struggle comes in. Yeah.
About flooding in Jakarta. As part of the cluster, we had a piece of work done by the Australian National University, and they looked at the social and economic impacts of flooding in Jakarta. And particularly, some of the most vulnerable communities are in the flood-prone, low-lying areas of Jakarta. And one of the interesting findings in surveying 600 households in those flood-prone areas is, even though they know that the flooding occurs pretty regularly, they actually don't do anything to prepare for it, and they're not prepared to relocate. They just live through it and then fix up the damage post-flooding, and then they stay doing exactly the same thing as what they've been doing for generations. So even though flooding has an impact on their lives, and their mobility and their prosperity and education, everything, that they don't really take any action to do anything about it. So I just wonder whether the scale of the wall was just, far beyond their daily living, and they just, if Jakarta's sinking, it's sinking, and we'll perhaps just deal with it, and it happens.
That's right.
Is from that type of social and economic group within Jakarta?
That's true, actually. Yeah.
Hi, Wikke. Thank you so much for explaining something so complex and something that I think you know a lot about that would be difficult to explain. So thank you for doing that. And I had a question. I noticed that it seems like there's always this coalition of actors, right? The different actors, and actually, some of them are similar across the two case studies. So, so other than what Liam mentioned being the scale of action and the distribution of agency, what other sort of actor factors that you think are important, like the role of leadership or the different mayors, and at that time also Jokowi and then Ahok was in power in Jakarta, and they also had very progressive views. And how do you contrast that with Mayor Risma's sense of agency or role in this in the comparison? And then and also maybe, if you have time, the media on the one hand, and in Jakarta and in Surabaya.
Sure. In terms of the political leadership, quickly, I think in Jakarta, comparatively speaking to Surabaya, is the political context is a lot more complicated, because it is a city in its own, but it is also the capital city, so national and sort of city-level governments are often sort of they are often not in agreement as well, and there are sort of internal kind of tensions there. So I guess the advantages of Surabaya in terms of the leadership is just we hear a lot more this one voice. So in Jakarta, for instance, it is the case, and it shows up in my research as well, that often the Jokowi or someone or the governor is saying one thing, but then when you go to the minister is also often sort of talk about this project in the media and such, you often hear a different story completely. So that's that. And then the other question was on the role of the media. Again, the landscape is a bit different. I think the media in Surabaya is particularly very supportive of the government. That's the sense I was getting. They were actually behind, and they were actually the sponsor of the green initiatives in many cases as well, and work very closely with the government in that. While in Jakarta, it's bigger, a lot more diverse media players, so they have their own. They are also politically sort of like linked. A lot of these media are backed by different political parties, basically. So you hear a lot more voices there. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Wikke. We're out of time. Thank you very much for this presentation.
Thank you all.
And feel free to ask Wikke questions if you want to have more discussion on this.